Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 3. The Female Frailty Myth. Girls are sometimes pretty and wear nice clothes and can sit on couches to watch us play cricket, but girls cannot run, jump or climb trees. Eton Schoolboy, Physical Culture, 1895. I am fascinated by the story of women's sport. How beliefs about women's bodies and the impact of physical activity held so long ago still have a massive influence on women's sport today. The more I've read, the more I can see that much stems from the Victorian ideal of femininity, the perception of the passive, gentle, delicate woman who would have neither the strength nor the desire to take part in strenuous activity or sports. These attitudes were reinforced by the female frailty myth, a long-held, unproven medical belief that strenuous sport would damage women's bodies and make them infertile. Girls were taught from an early age that they would become masculine and sterile, and their uteruses could fall out if they participated in a vigorous activity like sport. Because of these views, the weaker sex was prevented from taking part in sport for decades. Women banned from distance running and hockey through to ski jumping and boxing. Hard to believe that London 2012 was the first Olympic Games where women were allowed to compete in every sport. Throughout history, women have suffered discrimination in sport, with men sporting dominance going far beyond their physical ability to be faster and stronger in most head-to-head competitions. Men have held power in most sports, excluding women from any control over the very sports they might have played. Sports promoters and agents were predominantly male, and, with fewer women in corporate roles, sponsorship decisions were made by men. Since the early days when sports sections became a regular part of national newspapers, the sports media has been male-dominated. This not only resulted in men's sport always being the priority, but in many cases, if women's sport was reported at all, it was depicted as unfeminine and unnatural. What fascinates me now is how these archaic attitudes towards women's involvement in sport still have such a significant impact on attitudes to women's sport today. It perhaps helps to explain why women's sport still trails men's in terms of funding, sponsorship and media coverage. Sport and recreation have been a part of British society since the Middle Ages, with sports and games often part of celebrations and festivals for working people, while the wealthier classes enjoyed golf, archery and riding. But organised sport, as we know it today, with its clubs and rules and leagues, was not created until the late 18th century. Masculine sporting pursuits grew in popularity in Britain partly to counter men's fear that the foppish behaviour of the French court might influence them. Just think back to those images of aristocratic French men with wigs, powdered faces, elaborate clothes and stockinged legs. In the US, after the Civil War, male sport was seen as the path to virile, athletic manhood. It was also a way to provide discipline for the unruly masses and to achieve muscular Christianity. According to Susan Kahn, in her book Coming On Strong, sport and physical activity were thought to contain men's sexual energy, instill self-discipline and strengthen a man's moral fibre through muscular development. In England, formal, organised sports with new rules and regulations were being developed for boys attending public schools including Eton, Harrow, Rugby and Winchester. For the schools to play against each other competitively, compromise laws for football were drawn up by Cambridge University. Across the world, away from schools and universities, independent sports clubs were also developing for men and boys. At a similar time, in the US, the expansion of higher education had driven the growth of sport on college campuses. Collegiate athletic programs were established, with paid administrators and professional coaches for the young men attending. Organised sport was seen as something to focus the minds of underprivileged young men too, and was therefore adopted as a tool by YMCAs, churches and welfare workers. So where were the women at this time? As sporting prowess and athleticism became associated with masculinity and manhood, it was little wonder that women struggled to find their place in the world of competitive sport. Some women had been competing, however, even in the 18th century. The first recorded women's cricket match in England took place in 1745 between 11 maids of Bramley and 11 maids of Hambledon, all dressed in white. This paved the way for more women to take part in regular village cricket matches by the end of the century. Sadly, though, 19th century science characterised women as the inferior, weaker sex who were ruled by their reproductive systems, which resulted in pain and illness, mood swings and regular bleeding. Another belief at the time was that women were born with a finite amount of energy, and if they used it on too much physical activity in sports, they would not have enough energy to give birth. Self-professed medical experts did recommend some level of physical activity to help women strengthen their bodies, but this was more likely to be in the form of vigorous walking, dumbbell exercises or dancing than any involvement in competitive sport. Even as the bicycle was becoming popular across the world in the 1880s and 1890s, with an estimated 30,000 women taking up cycling in the USA alone, critics were warning of the dangers for women, which included uterine displacement, spinal shock, and pelvic damage. I particularly liked their warning that avid cycling could harden the face muscles into a hideous bicycle face, with a protruding jaw, wild staring eyes, and a strained expression. Working life was transformed by industrialisation in the 19th century, and, despite many working-class women taking physical jobs in factories, the medical community became fascinated by women's fragile bodies and minds, often prescribing complete rest as cure for many ailments, including female hysteria. With no real scientific evidence, doctors began to attribute traits of passivity or hysteria to female biology. The womb was seen as the basis for all female behaviour, and any damage to it through exertion would result in deranged behaviour and breakdown, jeopardising women's ability to conceive or potentially producing damaged offspring. These unfounded beliefs resulted in the control of women's bodies by the male medical profession. It was generally accepted that women were weak, delicate, and prone to nervous exhaustion. Women's perceived lack of natural sporting ability was assumed to be because of their physical incapacity, rather than anything to do with the excessive restrictions in their everyday lives. The way in which these attitudes still impact women's sport today can be very clearly seen in the world of Grand Slam tennis. The argument I so often hear about why women should be paid less than men is that they only play 3 sets versus men's 5 sets. It turns out the reason for this dates back to 1902 and, perhaps unsurprisingly, it was men who made the original decision. Despite the US Women's Singles Championships being played to 5 sets from 1891 to 1901, in 1902 the all-male team at the US Lawn Tennis Association decided, in their wisdom, that 5 sets was too strenuous for women. Though many leading female players challenged this decision at the time, all Grand Slams chose to follow their advice and have done so ever since, despite repeated protestations from the Women's Tennis Association. To counter this concern about women's weak health, the 1880s saw the development of women's physical educators. In 1879, the London School Board appointed its first lady superintendent of physical education, who drove the development of colleges where middle-class women were trained to become PE teachers. At the same time, in the USA, women were training women as PE instructors, who went to work in newly established PE departments in colleges and universities across the country. While this might have been a positive move for women's involvement in sport and recreation, it only reinforced the idea that the sole purpose of physical activity for women was to improve their weak health. Along with this perception of the weak female body, social conventions about femininity also impacted the development of women's sport. It's been suggested that the negative obsession with the way sporting women looked was because men felt threatened. If muscular activities like sport and exercise were what distinguished British men from the foppish Frenchmen, then their masculinity came under threat when the same activities were undertaken by women. One way of dealing with the threat was to belittle the women who tried to play. The very idea of female athletes made people anxious that men might lose their physical supremacy and, because of that, society might lose distinctly male and female characteristics. Women's sport therefore became associated with weakness, lack of aggression, and looking good. It is perhaps unsurprising then that no women took part in the first modern Olympic Games in 1896. By 1900, there were officially just 2 sports organised for women, tennis and golf. I was shocked to learn that even then, early forms of golf restricted women to half swings because anything else would have been unladylike. Not because we doubt a lady's power to make a longer drive, explained Lord Wellwood in a contribution to Golf by Horace G. Hutchinson in 1890, but because that cannot well be done without raising the club above the shoulder. Now, we do not presume to dictate, but we must observe that the posture and gestures requisite for a full swing are not particularly graceful when the player is clad in female dress. It was also around this time that the medical profession was developing the field of sexology, with its notion that heterosexuality was the norm and homosexuality was abnormal. So-called experts claimed that homosexuality in women could always be suspected in females who had short hair, dressed in men's fashions, or enjoyed sport like their male acquaintances. The public took to this view, which implied that any woman who ignored the requirement to look feminine while exercising must therefore be homosexual. A positive shift for women's sport in the US arrived in 1901 in the form of Constance Appleby, a graduate from the British College of Physical Education. Constance was unimpressed with the range of physical activities for women on offer at Harvard College, where she was then studying, which at the time included musical chairs and drop the handkerchief. She explained to her cohort that they were party games, but for real exercise, women in England played hockey. Constance went on to tour US colleges, spreading the word for hockey wherever she went. I love her attitude in justifying women's sport to prominent leaders. She said to one university president, "You want all these students to go out and do something in the world, to get the vote? What's the good of their having the vote if they're too ill to use it?" In the early 1900s, publications in Britain emerged that were focused on women's sport, including The Hockey Field, 1901, Ladies' Golf, 1912, and Golfing Gentlewomen, 1914. By 1914, the Badminton magazine of sports and pastimes even had its own women's section, but the coverage remained incredibly chauvinistic. Let young girls ride, skate, dance and play lawn tennis and other games in moderation, but let them leave field sports and rough outdoor pastimes to those for whom they were naturally intended, men. While these publications did help to build a community for women interested in various sports, the national press was still patronising about female participation. Women's cricket matches drew big crowds, but even W.G. Grace, who had a very talented cricketing daughter, said it was only a game for schoolgirls that ought to be abandoned when they grew up. Women's place in society was changing dramatically, however, thanks to the huge impetus of the women's suffrage movement. Despite several positive changes for women at the end of the previous century, women still did not have the right to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union adopted a more militant approach to gaining suffrage and, because of sport's links to masculine identity, chose to target male sporting events for their demonstrations. It is estimated that a sixth of the attacks organised by the suffragettes were on sports venues. Traditional male sports were their main targets, including golf clubs, where women had been excluded or viewed as second-class citizens. Acid was used to burn votes for women into the greens. Cricket pavilions were burnt down, racecourse grandstands, boating pavilions and billiard halls attacked, and attempts made to disrupt the boat race. The terrible climax of the campaign was Emily Davison's death, when she tried to stop the horse of King George V in the 1913 Epsom Derby. While these shocking events may have helped women to eventually get the vote, they probably did not help the cause of allowing women more access to sport. As a Times journalist pointed out at the time, attempts to spoil sport are not likely to win favour for any cause from a sporting nation. And then came the First World War, and the suffragettes' militant action ended to help with the war effort. With men away at the front, women took up roles in factories and businesses and in many cases had more time and opportunity to play sport. Before this, family life and men's financial power had often limited women's opportunities. As women moved into munitions work, they got better pay and had more leisure time. They began to play football in large stadiums in front of big crowds and in the process raise hundreds of thousands of pounds for charity. By Boxing Day in 1920, when Dick Kerr Ladies played St Helens Ladies, they drew a record-breaking crowd of 53,000 at Everton's Goodison Park, with an additional 14,000 waiting outside without tickets. By 1921, there were 150 women's football teams in the UK. The commercialization of sports began to take off in the US in the 1920s. Enterprising businesses saw the opportunity for leisure to be sold to consumers in the form of equipment, clothing, and entertainment. Professional sports developed, including baseball, boxing, horse racing, swimming, golf, tennis, and American football, with huge audiences paying to watch sport as entertainment. Alongside this, cultural changes for women saw the advent of the flapper era. Slim, short-haired, confident women who celebrated their independence reflected the break with tradition, and female athletes shared many of their characteristics. Teenager Gertrude Ederle symbolised all this when the Olympic swimming medalist from New York became only the sixth person to swim the English Channel, 2 hours faster than the 5 men who had gone before her. I love how much this must have annoyed many men at the time. Alongside teams like Dick Kerr Ladies, playing in front of packed stadiums in the UK, bigger than the crowds that had been watching men's football, national events were developing in the US for women's college sports, such as swimming, basketball, and athletics, attracting advertisers, media, and huge crowds. In 1920, the US sent its first women's team to the Olympics. The media at the time particularly liked the idea of women in tennis, golf, and swimming, as they were sports that men felt emphasised the grace and femininity of the female body. A new ideal of womanhood was evolving, a mixture of athletic femininity coupled with an undertone of sexuality. Male sports promoters looked to maximise the link between sporting success and sexuality to attract crowds, just as the media were beginning to focus on sexual attractiveness to explain the value of women's sport. In describing a 1925 athletics event with over 5,000 young women competing, the Baltimore Evening Sun stated, "It was a girly show, if ever there was one. It was a great gathering of budding and full-blooming beauty." Good Lord. As if that wasn't bad enough, I was shocked to discover that beauty contests were added to the sports arena, and from the late 1920s, national basketball tournaments also crowned tournament beauty queens from amongst the players. I spoke to Gail Newsham, author of In a League of Their Own and an expert on the Dick Kerr ladies, about what was happening in the UK around this time. She told me, on the 5th of December 1921, the FA banned women's football. They said women couldn't play on league grounds anymore, that it was a dangerous sport for women. It could affect their fertility, all those kinds of things. And for 50 years, women's football was in the wilderness. I think the Goodison match was the turning point, really. We can't have that, 53,000, because it was the second biggest crowd recorded at the time since records began in 1888. As Gail says, the FA claimed the decision was made on two grounds. First, because football was unsuitable for women, and second, because women were getting too much of the expense money. In other words, they were being paid as semi-professionals. Complaints have been made as to football being played by women. The council feel impelled to express their strong opinion that the game of football is quite unsuitable for women and ought not to be encouraged. To disprove the medical claims, the team invited 20 doctors to watch a game. The doctors declared it to be no more taxing than a day's heavy washing, agreeing there was no medical reason why women's football could not continue. Sadly, though, despite this, the ban in England remained in place and then travelled across the world to countries including Germany and South America. In Brazil, the birthplace of Marta, generally accepted as the greatest female player of all time, a law from 1941 to 1979 completely banned women and girls from playing football. Females were not allowed to play competitively, to play in schools, or even for fun in the park. The draconian law stated that women could not practice any kinds of sport that were incompatible with the female nature, based on a belief that it was dangerous for women to play football as it could damage their ability to have children and to work. It seemed that men felt threatened, particularly in their traditional areas of influence. The world of traditional men's work was changing, and women were beginning to enter the workplace and make demands around equality in relationships. Some believe that as changes like this occurred in society, men were desperately seeking areas they could protect and hold on to as their own, and sport was one of those areas. Bans on women's football across the world would remain in place for around 50 years until 1970, when they were gradually lifted in a piecemeal way. FIFA began to take charge of women's football with the unofficial Women's World Cup in Mexico in 1971. The final between Mexico and Denmark, which Denmark won, was played in the Azteca Stadium in front of a crowd of 110,000. The 1960s and 1970s proved to be an important time in the progress of all women's sport across the world, as leaders in the feminist movement recognised that the high-profile nature of sport could help support the women's liberation movement. In 1972, Billie Jean King won the US Open, receiving $15,000 less than the men's champion Ilia Nastase. She very publicly stated that she would not play the next year if the prize money was not equal. In 1973, the US Open became the first major tournament to offer equal prize money for men and women. Disappointingly, it took another 34 years for Wimbledon to do the same in 2007. An important event that undoubtedly helped improve opportunities for women in sport across the world was the Battle of the Sexes in 1973, where Billie Jean King, at just 29, took on and beat Bobby Riggs, a 55-year-old former professional player. Viewed by around 48 million people worldwide, and many more since the story was told again in the superb film of the same name in 2017, it was a real watershed moment for the profile of women's sport. Not only did it show that a woman could compete on a level with men, but it highlighted the commercial viability of women's sport for entertainment. Around this time, in response to the smaller prize money and lack of women's events put on by the US LTA, which made it hard for women to earn a living from playing tennis, Billie Jean led a group of female players to form their own tour. They found a sponsor in cigarette brand Virginia Slims, providing a more elegant route to lung cancer for women. And as other sponsors came on board, by the end of the year, nearly 40 players had registered for the tour with an impressive prize pool totaling nearly $310,000. On the back of the success of the Virginia Slims tour, King negotiated with the US LTA to create a women's division in 1973. Known as the Women's Tennis Association, WTA, it remains the most profitable US professional women's sports organisation. We were at the height of the women's movement and it was an exciting time to be campaigning, said Billie Jean King years later in an interview with The Telegraph. The year 1972 was also the one in which Title IX was passed into law in the US. In the words of historian Mary Jo Fessel, the biggest thing to happen to sport since the whistle. Title IX provides all US citizens with equal access to any programs or activities that received federal financial assistance, and, importantly, this includes sport. It means US public schools, the equivalent to state schools in the UK, are legally required to provide girls and boys with equitable sports opportunities. American universities that had offered thousands of sports scholarships to male athletes had to offer the same opportunities to female students. In the 5 decades since Title IX was enacted, sports opportunities for girls at US high schools have increased by more than 1,000% and by over 600% for women in universities and colleges. Before Title IX, 1 in 27 girls played sports in the US. Today, it's 2 in 5. Women's involvement in the Olympics also made progress around this time, and in 1964, women were finally allowed to compete in a team sport for the first time when volleyball was added to the lineup. This was followed in 1976 with basketball and handball, in 1980 by hockey, and 1996 by football, and in 2016 by rugby sevens. It was not until 1984 that endurance sports for women were included in the Olympics with the addition of cycling and the marathon. It will be 2024 before we see 50% male and female participation. The final decades of the 20th century proved to be an important time for equality in sport. Special action groups for women were created with a Women's Sports Foundation founded by Billie Jean King in the US in 1974, the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport established in 1981, and the Women's Sports Foundation, now Women in Sport, founded in the UK in 1984. Sport and physical activity were recognised as a human right in the International Charter of Physical Education and Sport, adopted in 1978 by UNESCO. One of the essential conditions for the effective exercise of human rights is that everyone should be free to develop and preserve his or her physical, intellectual, and moral powers, and that access to physical education and sport should consequently be assured and guaranteed for all human beings. The Brighton Declaration was established by an international working group on women and sport in 1994, organised by the British Sports Council and supported by the International Olympic Committee. This independent, coordinating body of government organisations aimed to be a catalyst for the advancement and empowerment of women and sport globally. The international treaty has become a roadmap to support the ongoing development of a more fair and equitable system of sport and physical activity fully inclusive of women and girls. In September 1995, more than 17,000 participants and 30,000 activists headed to Beijing for the opening of the 4th World Conference on Women with a single purpose in mind: gender equality and the empowerment of all women everywhere. Sport was directly referenced in the Beijing Platform for Action, which resulted in the sports ecosystem and stakeholders having a key role to play in ensuring gender equality on and off the pitch. Also in 1995, the IOC established a Women and Sport Working Group to advise the Executive Board on policies to ensure gender equality. This was elevated to the status of a commission in 2004, and the Women in Sport Commission now meets once a year to monitor the participation of women in the Olympics, as well as their representation in decision-making. Along with tennis and its 3 sets for women, the female frailty myth impacts other sports today. In badminton, women play to 11 points, but men play to 15. Women's basketball quarters in the WNBA are 10 minutes long, but the NBA quarters are 12 minutes. In athletics, women's shot, javelin and discus typically weigh less than men's, and hurdles are lower. In golf, ladies' tees are closer to the green. In artistic gymnastics, men compete in 6 events compared to just 4 for the women. Both complete a floor routine, but the men tumble silently for 70 seconds while the women perform to music for 90 seconds and must also incorporate dance movements to express their personalities, something not required for the men. After much debate in recent years and a campaign called #RunEqual, one very outdated gender imbalance in English sport that could finally be settled in 2021 is the distance of cross-country races. While women and men race over the same distances on the roads and the track, and the IAAF have equalised the distances run in the World Cross-Country Championships, in England, women's cross-country races are often much shorter. In regional championships, senior men run 15 kilometres, with senior women running 8 kilometres, just over half the longer distance. In the English National Championships, the difference is 12k to 8k. Not such a big difference, but the men are still running 50% further. I love the example that campaigners share to illustrate how ridiculous this is. It would be like the London Marathon being 26.2 miles for the men and only 14 miles for the women. While Victorian attitudes have much to answer for with regard to where women's sport is today, Moya Dodd, former FIFA council member and now one of the most influential women in global sport, is clear about how more recent history has impacted the progress of women's sport. She told me, "One of the great travesties of sport in the 20th century, actually, I think the greatest injustice with world sport ever, has been the exclusion of women from football. We would be living in a different world if the national bodies like the FA and the international bodies like FIFA had taken it upon themselves to just permit women to go ahead and play, and then to create competitions in which they could participate. We all know how popular football was in the First World War for women. This was a window of time where the men weren't playing, so in a sense there was plenty of bandwidth for the women to show what they could do, and, notwithstanding they probably had no history in playing the game, they got out there and they did a good enough job that 53,000 people showed up to watch them play by 1920. Then there were deliberate measures to exclude women, and then our grandparents and parents and we grew up in this world where women didn't really play sport and nobody was interested in watching it, so there was no professional career path. That was the world we lived in for pretty much all of the 20th century, and it's taken 100 years for us to get back to the point where you are seeing, once again, tens of thousands of people in stadiums watching women's sport. Thank you so much for listening to the serialization of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstiss. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.